always from the heart of the city, and now on demand 24/7 on the CHFI website. This is the soundtrack to accompany your tears. And I'm Don Jackson, around the world on the internet. Washington Irving wrote, "There is a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love." This hour, the tears of lovers and other strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Amanda Marshall leaving Birmingham. And Fergie and Big Girls Don't Cry. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. This hour, some excerpts from a past issue of the Old Farmer's Almanac, an article written by Jamie Cagliari. The author writes, and I quote, "A woman stands at a sink. We can't see what she's doing, but she's slumped over a bit. Her hair hides her face. She sniffles. Then her hand comes up and brushes her cheek. A tear? She's crying. Has her husband been cross to her? Or is she peeling an onion? Humans cry. There are unproven anecdotes of crying elephants and tearful golden retrievers, but humans are virtually the only creatures to shed emotional tears. Bartlett's Familiar Quotations has far fewer entries for cry and crying than it does for love. Popular music relies heavily on the word, either using it in lyrics or evoking an emotion that moves you to tears. Until recently, scientific resources were scarce on this most elemental of human functions. There has been research on infant cries, but not much about the rest of us. As Dr. William Fry, director of the Ramsey Dry Eye and Tear Research Center in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Jeffrey Kotler, author of The Language of Tears, have discovered, crying is no simple thing. The woman at the sink, for instance. If we could scoop up that brushed tear and analyze it, we might know why she is crying. If her tears are due to a tiff with her husband, they will contain more proteins, complex elemental substances that include essential compounds such as enzymes or hormones, than if her eyes are merely irritated by peeling an onion. Although other scientists aren't sure yet, Fry thinks this difference means that something unique happens when people cry emotional tears. Fry was able to isolate, in emotional tears, the hormone prolactin, which is released by the pituitary gland at times of intense emotion or stress and makes its way to the tear glands. Too much prolactin in your system can become toxic. So, crying is a way of cleansing the body of this during stress, just as irritant tears help cleanse the eye of smoke, onion fumes, or a stray eyelash. The fact that crying flushes away excess prolactin during stress probably accounts for the fact that 85% of women and 73% of men say they feel better after crying. and why some studies even indicate that men who do not cry, or who consider crying a sign of weakness, are more apt to suffer stress-related illnesses. Unquote. Your tears this hour with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Colin James, Into the Mystic, and 10cc, and I'm Not in Love. And I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Back to this Old Farmer's Almanac article by Jamie Cagalieri, and I quote, "Imagine the woman, let's name her Nadia, at the sink again. We've discovered that she's sad. Chances are she cries emotional tears 4 times more often than her ogre of a husband. No surprise. Women average 5.3 cries a month. When men cry, it's often hard to tell. Usually their eyes brim, but not many tears escape down the face." Unquote. More from this article and the research with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Deborah Cox and Beautiful You Are. Bonnie Tyler with a total eclipse of the heart, and Faith Hill and A Simple Cry. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. And back to this Old Farmer's Almanac article by Jamie Cagalieri, and I quote, "Take a different look at Nadia. She stands in her office at a major law firm where she works as the chief litigator. Her boss has just spoken crossly to her, probably even more sharply than her husband did that morning. But she stands with her hands on her hips, dry-eyed. As women move into traditional male worlds, the tears aren't as automatic. Nadia cries at home. She would never cry at work. In our culture, where more people of both sexes tend to cry more often than those of other cultures, one's occupation is as good a predictor as any for this tendency. Nurses cry. Doctors don't, as often. Therapists cry. Engineers don't. And as with Nadia, it all depends on where you are when you feel like crying. If you're English, you might cry only in private. If a tear slips out in public, chances are those with you will look away in embarrassment or discomfort. An Italian, though, is more likely to cry in public, whether happy or sad. If you are one of the Bosavi people of New Guinea, it gets more complicated. If visitors from another village come, for instance, they are expected to perform a night of singing and dancing for their hosts. Suddenly, a local villager will grab a torch and burn one of the visiting Bosavans on the shoulder. The victim will not cry or even show he is in pain. The villagers, though, will scream, cry, and carry on all night. The longer and harder the crying, the more successful the ritual is deemed to be. This ceremony, writes Jeffrey Kotler, is one of grief, of violence, of tribute, and reciprocity. The object of this exercise is to elicit strong emotional reaction in the participants to make them cry. Anthropologists observing the Bosavi people think the songs are presented not as taunts, but in the same spirit of sympathy with which guests themselves weep at the end of the ceremony for their hosts who have suffered. The entire ritual is a way of contriving tragedy so that everyone may cry in the end. When you think about it, it's not much different from what we do when we purposely play a song that makes us cry, or go to an opera or film that we know will make us weep. Both within the culture of the Bosavi, says Kotler, and in our own community, we have institutionalized tear ceremonies that help us to reflect on our feelings about our own existence through the lives of others, allowing us to experience our emotions safely without rocking the boat too much. Unquote. So think of a darkened movie theater where it is almost okay for both males and females to cry together, no matter their occupations. The 21st century version of the Western tear ceremony. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Mandy Moore and Cry, and Billy Ocean and There'll Be Sad Songs. Lovers and Other Strangers for November the 10th, 2009. A good a day as any for a good, healthy cry. In conclusion, in this Old Farmer's Almanac article, Jamie Cagliari goes on to write, and again I quote, "So perhaps the next time we see someone sobbing at the sink, it may be Nadia's husband or son crying over Field of Dreams. Or maybe it's just onions." Unquote. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Norah Jones, catching teardrops in her hand and don't know why. And Whitney Houston and Why Does It Hurt So Bad? I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. To conclude the hour, an old English prayer that was sent in to the Old Farmer's Almanac by Mrs. C.B. Terrell and included in the Millennium Primer some years back, and I quote, "Give me a good digestion, Lord, and something to digest. Give me a healthy body, Lord, and sense enough to keep it at its best. Give me a thoughtful mind, dear Lord, to keep the pure and good in sight, and when seeing sin, is not appalled, but finds a way to make it right. Give me a mind that is not bored, that does not whimper, whine, nor cry. Do not let me worry over much, dear Lord, about the fussy thing called I. Give me a sense of humor, Lord. Give me the grace to see a joke, to get some happiness from life, and pass it on to other folk." Unquote. You know, I think I just did. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. I hope you will tell all your friends about Lovers and Other Strangers. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.